It was Sunday, October the 5th in San Francisco, and the cathedral, decorated for the feast of St. Francis, was packed. The preacher was to be Margaret Mead, famous anthropologist, best-selling author, and the most academically honored social scientist in America. This engagement, to which she'd traveled almost 3,000 miles, marked the start of a typical week in her life. At the age of 74, she seems to have boundless energy for drawing attention to the lessons she has learned from a lifetime of studying primitive communities. She feels these communities must not merely learn from us, we must learn from them.
What we face today, perhaps the most acute test that Christianity has ever had to face, adaptable as it has been. We face the task of actually including the whole world, of recognizing that all men are indeed our neighbors and our brothers.
Following the service, Margaret Mead was the guest of honor at festivities in the cathedral precinct.
Thank you for this inspiring words. Now our task is to live them, right?
Yes, that's right. I know I've gone up in Cessnas plenty, when 3/4 of them come down, and I don't take unnecessary risks. I've got plenty.
No, I think the roots.
The next day, she flew to Claremont University, to a college specializing in the sciences. Before giving a lecture to a packed audience, she was greeted by the principal and a select group of students and taken to an informal seminar.
Go this way?
I think we're headed this way, Dr. Mead.
And now I'm never sure, whether you've all come with a lot of questions that you're prepared to ask at once, or whether you'd like to hear a few words first so as to get in a bit in step. So I'm going to suggest 2 or 3 things that I'm interested in. I'm interested in the fact of why this country is so incapable of learning, why we make the same mistakes over and over and over again, invent solutions and forget them, why so much of what goes on in this country is a pendulum, back and forth, when it ought to be a spiral.
The next day, she was met in Phoenix, Arizona, an area rich in Indian tradition. That day, her lecture was to be given at an anthropological museum famous for its collection of Indian crafts. And typically, the theme of her speech was that a culture is not a museum exhibit. It remains live only by adapting itself to modern conditions.
Window non-smoking, please.
Sure.
The next day, there was an early start for a flight to Tucson and another lecture. Following the visit to Tucson, she flew north to a Navajo reservation, accessible only by light aircraft. Living in this infertile part of the country, the Navajo Indians grapple not only with the problems of poverty and political impotence, but also face the issue of how to retain their Navajo identity in a modern world.
Your right foot on the step there.
How do you do?
How do you do?
Good morning.
My name is Tom Apsedy. I'm the president of the college at Navajo Community College. And Dr. Tippeconic, he's a vice president, academic vice president.
We've had a wonderful trip, flying through the canyons and looking down.
Today, the lecture was to be in a new college where the buildings were in the style of the traditional Navajo hogan, with its fire in the center of the room. It was to this remote spot that the Navajo had driven from many miles around to hear what Margaret Mead had to say.
We've all been brought up on a bunch of mythology. We've all been brought up to believe that what we've got today is just remnants of what was here before, or to believe it was always here. We've got to stop this idea that the old culture was real and the new culture isn't real. That somehow if you put an electric light in a Hogan, it isn't a Hogan anymore.
The day ended with a flight back to Phoenix, a stop for dinner, and then an overnight flight for the 2,000 miles to New York, where another busy day was planned. Here she was to address a meeting of the National Council of Churches on the hazards of plutonium as an alternative source of energy.
As a scientist, I represent a group of scientists who believe that ethical and social issues should be decided by the citizenry of a country, but that it is the duty of the scientists to try to make clear the technical issues involved when these technical issues are very complicated.
The same afternoon, she travelled to Tarrytown for her regular discussion with a brains trust of intellectuals from different disciplines who meet here to exchange ideas on current issues. After dinner, the philosopher Ernst Schumacher was to address the group. Margaret Mead now lives in New York City, and Adam Kuper, an anthropologist who came from England to meet her, first visited the American Museum of Natural History, a few minutes from her home. It's here that Margaret Mead has worked for almost half a century, part of that time as curator. One of the halls contains an exhibition she set up to illustrate the arts and customs of the people of the Pacific amongst whom she has lived. The objects are fascinating, and this is one of the most popular halls in the museum, but to the anthropologist, these are more than curiosities. It's the meaning behind them which is important, and for Margaret Mead, this is particularly so. She distinguishes herself from her more conservative colleagues by her determination to make known those meanings beyond the confines of the museum and beyond the confines of anthropology. It is an awareness of the practical value of her work that has been important throughout her life. After a happy childhood, she spent an unhappy year at a Midwest university. And then, in 1920, Margaret Mead moved to Barnard College in New York. About it, she wrote, "Here I found the kind of student life that matched my earlier dreams. In the course of those 3 undergraduate years, friendships were founded, and by the end of those years, I knew what I could do in life."
I was the first undergraduate who elected as an undergraduate to go into anthropology. The reason probably that I could be attracted and make a plan so early was because I was a social science child. But my grandmother was very much interested in pedagogy. She was a teacher of little children and read Froebel and Montessori and all of those things. My mother was a sociologist who made the first study of immigrants in this country. And my father was an economist who moved from very abstract economics to an interest in how society really worked, so that I grew up in a kind of fieldwork atmosphere, although the idea of anthropological fieldwork was just being invented. As a child, I knew, of course, that women used their brains and did things because my mother and my grandmother had done so, and I knew that marriage and children and using your brains weren't incompatible because, after all, I wouldn't have been there if they had been. So it was a question of what I wanted to be, and I wanted to be a lot of things, a lawyer and a nun, and at one point, up to about 16, I expected to be a portrait painter. And then I discovered that if I did that, I couldn't go to college. I had to go to art school. In college, I had a double, what we call a major in the United States, concentration in English and in psychology. And then in my senior year, I met anthropology. Now, I was still hesitating, however, between writing, which I enjoyed doing, and I thought I might possibly be a poet, only I roomed with one, discovered I wasn't really one, or politics, because I was a good debater and I edited the college paper, and journalism and debating are the background of politics. or science. And when I decided on science, because I thought that was a place where you could make any contribution you made was important. You didn't have to be a genius to go into science, whereas you did in the arts in the United States in those days. And then anthropology attracted me away from the other social sciences that I've been working with, because Professor Boas and Dr. Benedict, my two professors, both insisted that it was important to do this now.
Why?
Because we were learning so much from studying these remote peoples that were very different from ourselves. It's much harder to learn from members of your own society.
What was anthropology about in those days?
It was just an emerging subject, you see. And in Germany, there were several different schools. There was one that believed that the thing to do was to trace the same object around the world, on the assumption if you found it in Tierra del Fuego in Tasmania, it must be the same thing. Things were only invented once and then spread. And there was another version of that in England at just about the time that I came into anthropology. There were people who believed that everything had originated in Egypt. So, you know, if you found a special kind of a prow of a canoe, and you found a canoe with a prow in the middle of the Pacific and one on a lake in Africa, they both must have come from Egypt. No one could have thought up the idea of decorating a prow. Then there was also a German school, and that was connected with the American school, that believed in the psychic unity of mankind. And the Americans, when I was working under Professor Boas, who started in Germany and came to this country, we worked with the assumption of the psychic unity of mankind.
What did that mean? That's a nice phrase.
That meant that we were all members of the same species, and that however different the conditions under which we lived, and whether there were people who still used stone tools, and that was all, whether there were people who didn't count beyond 3 or 4, that because they'd been isolated from the mainstream of civilization. It wasn't because their capacities were less, but that the difference in capacity between the most remote group of people and the most civilized group of people at the moment. And, you know, we also knew that people had been civilized in the past and were peasants today, without anything, a trace really of the civilization of the past. We assumed that those differences were due to their culture. The word culture, in the anthropological sense, was hardly known then. And people still use culture to mean cultured, you know, interested in music and art and traveled and having sort of cosmopolitan manners.
Well, what was this new anthropological sense of culture?
The new anthropological sense was that you studied the whole shared, learned behavior of a group of people. And you called it the culture, and it was the tools people used and the lullabies they sang to their babies, the way they built houses and buried their dead, and their religious beliefs were all part of their culture.
Franz Boas, the father of American anthropology, wanted her to study adolescence in an American Indian society, but she wanted to study changes taking place in the cultures of Polynesia. They compromised, and the young student went to Polynesia, but to study the problem which Boas had chosen. The new technique of fieldwork was to learn the culture by living it, and this is what Margaret Mead did. She immersed herself in the role of an adolescent Samoan girl, the subject of her study.
The Germans were convinced that adolescence was a terrible time, and all the words we used about it came from Germany. Weltschmerz, world pain, Sturm und Drang, storm and turmoil. All these were the words they used about adolescence. And Professor Boas had come from Germany to this country, and we were borrowing a good many of the German ideas at that point. So, you know, the thing that we do historically in anthropology is to try to pick a crucial problem and work on it, because you can't just go out and say, I'll study the whole of human development from the cradle to the grave. You wouldn't stay there long enough. And so you try to pick a point that's really crucial, and that if you've done something with it, you've moved further ahead theoretically.
All right, adolescent girls, but why in Samoa? Could it
Well,
done
in
anywhere?
Samoa, because there was a boat there every 3 weeks. One of the provisos, because I kept being told about all the people that had died doing field work or been killed somewhere, and there was a sort of litany got recited all the time. So finally, Boaz agreed I could go if I went somewhere where there's a boat every 3 weeks. And Samoa was the one place where there was a boat every 3 weeks that wasn't totally part of modern civilization like Hawaii or New Zealand. See, they were the same people speaking the same language, but Hawaii was a very, cosmopolitan part with everybody in the world there, and New Zealand had a large European population. Samoa didn't. And yet there was a boat every 3 weeks. And of course, since I got there, I set to work to get to an island where there wasn't a boat every 3 weeks, but was part of Samoa, but was more remote. The first thing I had to do was to learn the language. Now, this was new. Anthropologists were not required to learn the language in those days. We just had a few people who were children of missionaries who happened to know a language. They were required to learn about the language, to learn the grammar, to take down very careful texts, but not to use it in everyday life. But I was going to have to study young girls, living people, and see what they were like. Now, after 6 weeks, I spoke the language well enough to go out and stay in a village where no one spoke English. Then I spent 10 days in the house of chiefs that were accustomed to entertain portentous visitors, and so they knew what to do with them. And they spent a lot of time teaching me how to do things, how to take a shower with the whole village there modestly, which meant that you tied one kind of a sarong around under your arms and took a dry one with you. And then you took the shower with 40 people watching. And then you put the dry one around the wet one and dropped the wet one on the ground and put the dry one around you fast and didn't mind.
To what extent did you become a Samoan?
I didn't become a Samoan at all. I mean, one doesn't become a member of another culture, but one learns to behave in it as a polite foreigner would do. So I learned how to be courteous, how to ask questions courteously. I learned how to sit and stand and receive a gift and start a dance. You stand up and you clap your hands a little bit first. If you're very young and very tentative, which I was when I danced, I learned never to speak standing up erect if someone else was seated, and always to bend over, very far over, in front when you walked in front of someone of rank. I still get a funny little itch in my back if I walk upright in front of someone for whom I have great respect. This is getting easier as I get older. And I don't like standing up on a platform and having people come up from down below to ask me questions. I always squat down, which is the courteous thing to do in Samoa, but looks a little funny on one of our platforms.
After studying the girls for 9 months, it was apparent that they didn't suffer the adolescent crises of their American counterparts, and the book written soon afterwards pointed out that this crisis could be avoided when the cultural conditions were right, as they were for the girls in Samoa.
The girls were right at the center of pressure. They had as many younger children they could boss as there were older people that could boss them. They were not asked to work very hard yet or make any choices. They were allowed to pick their lovers fairly freely, or if they didn't want lovers, they could live in the house of the missionary and be protected from them until they felt a little older. So that most of the things that are hard on adolescents in modern society, all sorts of conflicts about sex and marriage, ignorance about life, and the Samoans children had peeked through the blinds of houses and seen birth, and they'd watched lovers, and they knew what was going on in the world, and they'd seen death often too. These things that made it hard for adolescents here weren't there. So I was able to come back and say that adolescence is not necessarily the kind of time that we've made it in Europe and America, that the kind of stress that we put on young people induces the kind of Sturm und Drang, the storm and stress that exists, but it isn't necessary. Now, I didn't know at that point You know, whether there'd be 20 primitive societies or 200 that would show the same thing or not. But in anthropology, you only have to show once that it's possible for a culture to make, say, a period of life easy where it's hard everywhere else, in order to have made your point, that if any society can have institutions and arrangements that make it easy to grow up, then it isn't biologically given that you have to have a terrible time. And that was the principal point that I made when I wrote Coming of Age in Samoa.
Coming of Age in Samoa became, of course, a runaway bestseller, as it remains. Why do you think it has this general appeal?
Why it became a bestseller? I think it became a bestseller partly because I wrote it in English. And in the United States, we have a very German tradition of scholarship. And so most scholarly work, or work that was based on scientific inquiry, was unreadable, except by the specialist. And I wasn't trying to write a popular book. I was trying to write a book that would be intelligible to the people that might use it. And those were principally teachers, social workers, psychologists, people who were studying or educating or worrying about adolescent girls. So I wrote it in English, and the result of writing it in English was everybody could read it. And it hit just a moment in history when people were very much interested in the South Seas, very much interested in relaxing many of the taboos that existed in our society, when people were just beginning to read Freud and beginning to try to understand the relationships between the biologically given and the way the society was organized. So it was a very fortunate combination, I think, of the particular people I found, the particular period it was done, and the way I chose to write it.
Luther Cressman, Margaret Mead's first husband, was studying for the church. They got married in their student days, but their marriage didn't survive a long separation. On the boat returning from Samoa, she met the brilliant New Zealand anthropologist Rio Fortune and married him. Soon the couple undertook one of the most ambitious field programs ever attempted. They studied 5 cultures in succession, beginning in the Admiralty Islands in Manus. Here lived a commercially minded group of people obsessed by trade and money. Their houses were built on stilts in a lagoon as a precaution against resentful trading partners. All social relationships were founded on a complicated framework of debts and mortgages, culminating in the marriage exchange. When a girl was married, she was given away in a costume of dog's teeth, shells and beads, the local currencies. These represented a debt which could take a lifetime to repay. The driving force of these money-minded people was the belief that any faltering would lead to punishment by the ghosts and spirits they feared. Living in this community, Margaret Mead and her husband found themselves drawn into this world of competition and barter.
Well, we lived in a stilt house. We had to build a house. They first had to agree where we could build it. Then we had to buy every house post separately. We had to haggle for every piece of beetle palm to put on the floor. Your floor is made of strong, narrow trunks of trees and then little pieces of slats in a few places. We had to buy every 10 shingles made of sago leaves separately. So it took about 2 months to get the house built. It wasn't as handsome a house as a native house because the native houses are shaped in a sort of gentle arch, but the native houses are totally dark, and I had to have light. So the roof came down less well, and everything fell through the floor, and you dreamt about a hardwood floor and what it would be like to walk on something that didn't go like that and didn't let everything fall through. It was a native house that was less elegant than the ones the natives had.
This time, Margaret Mead concentrated her attention on the children. Here she found an amazing discrepancy between the free and easy life of the children, for whom the village was an adventure playground, and their anxious parents, harassed by their competitive economic system. This was the paradox she explored in one of her best-known books.
The principal points that I made in that book was that although the way children were brought up might look very different than the life that they were going to lead. But in the end, the society always gets you. And a lot of these children were given the kind of permissive life, no property, no obligations, play all day in the water, develop skills. It was very popular in progressive education in those days. And I was pointing out that all this permissiveness and all this cooperativeness ended up with there being competitive, hard, grinding, driven, ambitious adults, and that you didn't make a society over by making over the children, as many people in our society at that point really believed they could. Now, I think that was the most important message. I didn't completely understand why the children never imitated the adults. They imitated behavior all the time. They paddled a canoe like an adult. They poled a canoe like an adult. They threw a spear at a fish like an adult. They had nothing to do with adult social life, with ceremonies, with the ownership of property, with seances with ghosts at all. And that puzzled me then. It wasn't until many, many cultures later, and 25 years later, that I realized they were imitating the fact that the adults didn't like the things they were doing. And they didn't like the heavy burdens of their economic life, so the children imitated them by not doing them. And that their imitating of adult skills and their refusal of adult preoccupations were the same kind of thing.
Following a study of Omaha Indians, in 1931, Margaret Mead and her husband returned to the Pacific, where they researched 3 more cultures, and the result was another influential book. Here she looked at the question whether the roles of men and women could be freely shaped by the culture in which they lived. She started by looking at a village of the Arapesh tribe.
The first people we worked on, and we didn't plan to work on them at all, we planned to go further inland, but the carriers wouldn't take us in. They dumped us in a mountain. So we studied a group we had never intended to study. And I found both men and women very maternal, interested in growing children and planting food and feeding it to children, making the children grow, with very little difference in personality between men and women. They both were stylized on what we would call a rather maternal parental mold. Well, we came down from there looking, and I wasn't awfully pleased. I mean, we'd done a big study of the culture, and it was an interesting culture. But for my particular problem, it wasn't very interesting. It didn't seem to show me very much. The next place we picked, we again picked blindly out of a hat. It was the first tribe off the Sepik River about whom nobody knew anything, except they liked buttons. And we discovered they were replacing cowrie shells with buttons as ornaments for flutes and things of that sort. So they were again totally picked out of a hat. The reason I'm emphasizing this is because in the end, these 3 tribes that I worked with made such a pretty pattern that people are inclined to think I must have picked them to make the pattern. They don't understand the pattern wouldn't have been there if I hadn't found the people. And this is something that's very hard for experimentalists, like psychologists who work with rats, to understand what an anthropologist does. That you go there with an open mind, find out what's there, and what's there is always interesting, but you can't predict it in advance. Now, these people were the really just almost straight opposite of the Arapesh. They were cannibals, very fierce, very warlike. The women were as tough as the men. The women climbed coconut trees, which is very unusual in New Guinea, did most of the fishing, so that the men could spend their time in war and in new alliances. The children were sent out as hostages at the age of 5 or 6. Both men and women hated having children. But women wanted male children if they had to have one at all, and men wanted female children. So if a woman had a girl child and the husband wasn't around, it would be pitched in the river. And children were pitched in the river, still alive after birth, wrapped up in a bark. Somebody else would pull them out and see if they were the sex they needed. Because once you had one sex, you had to have the other to balance things out for a marriage exchange. It was a society that was exceedingly harsh, fierce, very jolly, They describe eating people with great gusto, and in which no one was parental, and both men and women were positively sexed, belligerent, fierce. Well, I looked at this again, and I didn't yield much, you see. All it said was, well, you can turn both men and women into X kind of a personality or into Y kind of a personality. I wasn't getting any contrast between the sexes, only between the cultures. Well, then the third place we went, again we didn't go where we'd planned to go. We'd planned to go to a place called Washcook. We went up and looked at it and found that you walked a mile and you found a man and a woman and a child and a dog, and you walked another 2 miles and found another man, 2 women, a child and a dog. And I had had that among the Arapes. I was tired of these very scattered little communities. I wasn't going to do this again. It's too hard to work with. And so we went to the Chamberlain Lake, which everybody said was just beautiful, and it was just beautiful. It looked too good to be true. Black water like satin with great pink and white water lilies on it and blue lotuses and aigrettes and blue herons standing among the water lilies against a sky with beautiful clouds in it. I mean, it was one of those picture book places. And here I found what provided the necessary contrast. Here was a place where the men were expected to be everything that we think women are, and the women were expected to behave the way we think men do. The women were businesslike and efficient and handled all the finances and dressed up the men and the children. The men were catty, they went shopping, they wouldn't cooperate with each other, they flirtatious, artistic, and not at all interested in fighting. And the women were cooperative, slapped each other on the back, moved all their stoves into one house and cooked together. You know, one of the things they say is that women are not cooperative, that men have all these social bondings because they went hunting elephants, and women don't. Well, this was a society in which the women were briskly cooperative as if they were on teams, and the men were, each one was sort of off by himself being coquettish and worrying about the feathers in his hair. Now this provided, of course, the design in which I then realized that there's a tremendous range in temperament, as in biologically given bases of personality in every group. So that what I came back with from sex and temperament was the recognition that given temperaments, biologically given temperaments, recur and recur in every population. But which is assigned to which sex, or which class, or which caste will vary by the culture.
Later, her report was followed by a more wide-ranging study in which she raised the question of how far the roles of men and women are determined biologically and how far they are determined by the culture in which they live. This book prefigured a lot of the philosophy of women's liberation.
What I was doing was pointing out the cultural factors in the way women were treated. And it was very early, of course, and we weren't yet facing the population explosion. And the thing that has given women's liberation a major chance is not only that we're liberating everything at the moment, any group of people who feel at a disadvantage are pointing out their disadvantages, but the population explosion all over the world means that at present society does not want to pressure women or men into having lots of children. And that gives people a chance to be individuals. And women and men are being given a chance to do something else besides be parents.
To get to a very concrete, rather crude question, what would you say today are the given differences between male and female?
Well, I'd say that women still tend to play out life more in the theater of their own bodies. That the fact that their own body is a place where a child is produced for 9 months, and that the whole of the personalities involved in this development of the child is a different thing from the male's participation. And now we're trying to equalize this a great deal by having young fathers participate in prenatal instruction, present at the birth, holding the infant a great deal, and we found we have a potential in men of response to very little creatures, so that if you let a young father look after a very little baby, before it's lost its grasping reflex, he simply can't resist that hand around his finger. He's hooked. And so that there are biological bases in men for parenthood, but they're different from the bases in females, for instance. Now, there's the whole point of treating women as mysteries. When you read right through literature, we're always hearing about women being so mysterious. I've never seen a book that said a man was mysterious. And the reason why is that his whole sexual apparatus is visible, whereas what goes on in a woman has always been very inaccessible. And nobody quite knew what was happening, although hunters knew more than agricultural people, and cannibals knew quite a lot, but nevertheless, it was hidden. It was hidden from a woman herself, as well as hidden from other people. Now today we have all sorts of devices, so you actually can see what's going on. And the inside of the body isn't much more mysterious than the outside. And this will be, again, an equalization of relations between men and women.
Rio Fortune and Margaret Mead had worked alone together in 5 different societies. Then, studying the Chambuli, they had a colleague nearby, the British anthropologist Gregory Bateson, and he was drawn into their discussions. They began to collaborate, but this wasn't always easy. They had their own problems of temperament.
Well, you know, anthropological field work is very stressful. Part of it is like a team of actors or acrobats that work together and work together very hard and enjoy working together, but use up a lot of energy doing it, so that they're likely to be very exhausting marriages. And then you always have the problem of what is the relationship of the style of the culture to you personally. Now, Manus was fine, and it was the best field work Rayo and I ever did, because we neither of us identified with the Manus. And even though he expected them to be worse than they were, and was always telling me not to let the people move me because they were probably up to something, which they weren't, and I expected them to be better, and was disappointed that they were so pedestrian and unlovable in many ways. Still, we neither of us identified with them, so we could work together and develop new methods very well. But that never worked again. Then when we got back to New Guinea, Arapesh I identified with considerably, and Rayo didn't. My favorite informants he couldn't bear. They were too responsive. They were always paying attention to other people. They wouldn't sit still and do the kind of work he wanted doing. Sisters-in-law were friends, and he worked in cultures where sister-in-laws were natural enemies, which he thought they ought to be. Then when we went to Mendugamore, he was as repelled by the Mendugamore as I was, but he felt they were much more like himself. So he was fighting things in himself in the Mendugamore, while I was just fighting the Mendugamore and him to a degree too, in trying to live through this really very, very stressful period with mosquitoes. You tried to take a splash shower, and you had to have something in your hand to get the mosquitoes off you, and bathe as fast as you can, and the river came roaring up, and it was a pretty difficult place to be. Then Chambly, you see, we got into a position where the men were put in this sort of dependent, exhibitionistic position, which Rayo found very uncongenial, and the women were this solid, hard-working, managing group of people. So there was tremendous amount of stress. I mean, Rayo and I did 5 cultures together. And it was all of them were very productive, but they were differentially stressful. And when we finished working that year, I mean, I had about come to the conclusion that we couldn't live in the field all the time, and that even the field wasn't a very comfortable place to work. That his methods of working and mine were getting more and more stressful all the time. I came back to this country. Gregory went back to Cambridge. Rayo went to London and worked under Malinowski, and then elected to go back again to the South Seas.
And you married Gregory Bateson?
And I married Gregory Bateson.
With Bateson, not only a new marriage, but a new working partnership began. Together they travelled to Bali, and again the subject to be investigated was the way in which cultural practices shape personality. In anthropology, there is always the problem of how to bring back evidence which other people can assess. So now, for the first time, Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson decided to use photographs, not merely to illustrate, but to represent their findings. They took over 25,000 photographs and developed them all in the field. These photographs conveyed the style of Balinese life. Here the dance and mime, which to the Balinese are so important. A particularly effective technique was to take a number of photographs in rapid succession over a short period of time, which provides a detailed record of an event. This is the study of a woman's hand movements on her mouth. This is an example of Balinese self-absorption. The woman ignores her child. This shows how a Balinese mother teaches her baby. First, she stimulates him with her attention. Then, suddenly, she turns away. The baby is puzzled and frustrated and tries to regain her attention in vain. This was not just a piece of cruel play, but a method of forming the characteristically detached Balinese adult.
The mother gets the child all worked up in a jealous position, and she looks out the window, looks at her neighbor and says, oh, the beans were very expensive in the market today. Well, the child is screaming with jealousy and rage. Now, people who do that to children here, some of them give up. They're just as being met with this bland non-responsiveness. And instead of going screaming, they give up, they become mute, they withdraw from society. But the Balinese, at the same time that they were teaching their children like this, were providing all sorts of theatricals in which you could go into trance and take a dagger and put it against your chest and then go and kill the witch, who represented the evil mother. But she didn't die. She was just a dancer, and she came up again at the next ceremony. So you really weren't afraid you'd kill your mother, or you undoubtedly wanted to. You know, we find very often in our own society that people who, if they didn't write poetry or plays or paint pictures, might be driven into positions of insanity because they had no way of expressing themselves. And we find that in societies where there's no religion, no religious ritual at all for them today, and no ceremonial, and no group way of expressing things, that many people are driven over the edge of insanity who would fit in very happily in a more elaborate society. So I think what we learned from Bali is that you can really subject children to extraordinary extremes of trauma if in the same society the resolutions are there in artistic and religious forms.
After years of field studies, Margaret Mead had become an authority on child raising, and once more her interest turned to having a child herself. Characteristically, her observations shaped her decision.
Well, I was told that I would always miscarry. And so for quite a long time I didn't try to have a child because what was the use? Then after Mandugamore, and looking at what was done to a culture when they didn't value children, I decided I was going to have one child if it took 10 miscarriages. That you just couldn't consider not having children if there was a possibility of having a child. Remember, this is before the population explosion. But I'd always wanted 6 children, and I was looking at a situation where it seemed to me was essential to the functioning of human beings to care about children, which I still think is true, but I don't think they have to have them themselves. But I wanted to have a child myself.
Catherine was born in 1940, delivered by Dr. Spock. The arrival of a daughter hardly interrupted her work. She considered one child could be taken in her stride. Only 2 would have changed her life. This was wartime, and now anthropologists were called upon to use their expertise. During and after the war, Margaret Mead was to visit England and in lectures and broadcasts help the British and their American allies understand each other's customs.
We always seem to be boasting to the English. They always seem to be talking down their noses to us. And I could point out to audiences that in this country, the children who were born here always knew more about the country than the parents who'd been the immigrants. Whereas in England, the parents always knew more than the children, and the children were supposed to listen. And then I worked particularly on the question of the relationship between American troops and English girls. You know, it was a terribly touchy situation. Most of the English men in service were overseas, so there were no men there, except American men. The American men were used to the girl holding all the vetoes in any situation. They were used to asking for everything and getting nothing. And a really successful date was when a man asked for everything and a girl gave him nothing, which made him know she was a fine girl and he was a fine man, because he'd had the courage to ask and she'd had the courage to refuse. Well, this isn't the way relationships were built up in England. Men were supposed to be responsible and not to ask for things they didn't expect to get. And as one of my English friends said to me, an English man, said, you know, an Englishman doesn't go out with a girl except for an ulterior reason, good or bad. And so Americans would make all sorts of passes at English girls just to be friendly. I mean, it's the sort of thing you should do. They'd either get a terrible rebuff, in which case they decided they hated Britain, that there was no place you could fish or hunt, and the beer was warm, and that didn't promote good relations. Or the girl would sort of string them along a little bit for about 3 days and then take them home and introduce them as her intended bridegroom, and they hadn't intended that either. So there was a lot of friction and a lot of misunderstanding.
During the war, the people of Manus, whom Margaret Mead studied, were suddenly confronted with the 20th century. After the bitter fighting with the Japanese, the island became a supply base and staging post for the Pacific War. Fascinated, the people of Manus watched the parade of modern technology, particularly impressed when among the Americans they saw black men like themselves mastering this new culture. In 1953, Margaret Mead returned to Manus to find a new society being formed. Almost overnight, the people had been persuaded by a new leader that they should cast out their old culture with its economic burdens and avenging ghosts. They had rebuilt their houses on dry land, and then, within the next 15 years, were to adopt a completely new life based on cooperation among themselves and links with the modern world.
Good morning, boys and girls.
Good morning, teacher.
How are you this morning?
We are very well.
Inland, they'd transformed their village with a large new house. The people, previously suspicious of each other, were now cooperating as never before to create a completely fresh, if somewhat alien life. Here was an example of dramatic change, and for Margaret Mead, this raised the question of whether it's possible for a people to take up modern techniques and yet retain values central to their culture, whether in spite of violent change, people can remain themselves.
If you scatter them all through a population, so you can't find the community from which they came. And if they go to a new place and can't reconstitute a community, then you get genuine loss. Some societies in New Guinea have virtually been shot to pieces. A lot of them have died, they've moved to other places, but others have kept something together. Now, In 1932, I studied the village of Aleatoa up on a mountain, the Arapesh village. It was a very barren mountain, and the food was very poor, and the land was very poor. After World War II, they all came down to the beach, scattered all through other villages, and I couldn't find them. And then 3 years ago, I went back to New Guinea. They'd all regathered themselves. They'd all taken up land in a new land scheme that the Development Bank had developed. They were all on another island, everybody there except the people that were away in school, completely reconstituted.
It sounds very attractive to think of the way in which these cultures are in a way perpetuating themselves, but isn't there a danger that they might end up as ghettos within a larger culture?
Well, there's always the danger if one group feels superior to another, that one will be boxed up in a ghetto, or boxed up in a class, or boxed up in a particular occupation. Now, I think that it's valuable, if possible, for us to retain every culture in the world, and certainly every culture of any size. Now, in New Guinea, we have almost, not quite 3 million people and 700 languages. Retaining those languages very long is not going to be practical. They're going to have one language for the nation. And this has happened in many parts of the world, and it will happen again. I'm not advocating that Italians should come to America and be Italians forever. I like them when they come, as they have done, to live close enough to each other so that when they become Americans, they're a slightly different kind of American, and they add something to America. Just as the Scots speaking English and going all over the English-speaking world take something with them when they go. Now, if they stay for 4 or 5 generations, they're going to probably end up as Australians or New Zealanders or Canadians. But what we want to do is to treasure cultural identities as they develop. And remember, new ones are developing all the time.
Margaret Mead has continued to return to the Pacific both as an observer and as an honoured guest. Her discussions are a dialogue. The people tell her about their progress and their problems, and she passes on her advice.
Now, it is very important that the new generation, the younger people who have learned English and have gone away to school, that when they come back, they both bring new customs with them and remember the ways of their forefathers also. If you forget entirely your grandfathers, your great-grandfathers, and where they lived and what they did, then you will be people that have no ground under your feet, who have no roots in the ground, who belong only in the present and have no idea of the past.
This is the world in which Margaret Mead has spent much of her working life. It is her laboratory where she can observe the influence of culture at work.
You once wrote, "I have spent most of my life studying the lives of other peoples, faraway peoples, so that Americans might better understand themselves." Have Americans understood themselves better as a result of your studies?
Oh, I think so. It's very hard to know what you did and what other people did, and it's totally impossible, I think, to figure out which of us, under what circumstances, made contributions. Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture has been read by generations of college students who weren't anthropologists in the humanities. Malinowski has been very widely read in many other disciplines. But I think we could say that the effect of those of us who went out and described other people in terms that were intelligible to British or French or American readers have altered those people's understanding of the importance of culture. That there are things that couldn't happen today in this country, really, that happened 40 and 50 years ago. We had a famous radical case called the Sacco and Vanzetti case. Vanzetti was a fishmonger who was accused of a holdup. And over 20 Italian housewives testified they'd bought eels from him on Christmas Eve that covered the entire time. The New England jury said human beings don't eat eels, and Vanzetti went to death because this wasn't an alibi. In World War II, we had a general that said, well, if we're going to send people to Asia, teach them the Asian language. And when we said, well, there are quite a lot of different languages in Asia, he said, teach them the commonest one. Well, 10 years later, when we were doing, or 15 years later, when the Peace Corps was set up, we knew enough about differences in language and habits and food habits, and we knew the things that people were likely to encounter, and we could set up a very different kind of program.
But as a scientist, didn't this, in a way, misdirect your efforts, that your main public, as you saw it, was the general American public rather than your scientific colleagues?
But my main public has not been the general American public. I mean, though I have always written one book for the general American public. I have also always written technical monographs for my colleagues, most of whom read the book for the general public instead of the technical monograph, very often because it's too difficult for them. Writing these books, which form part of the climate of opinion which is necessary if anthropology is to continue to make any contribution, is only one part of what I've been doing.
But isn't it fair to say that one of the main thrusts of your work has been, in a very general sense, as a reformer?
No, I don't think of it as a reformer. Reformers are people that are spending their time doing over their own society after their own heart in some way. I'm not interested in doing over my own society. I'm interested in the future. What I'm trying to do is, by the most careful scientific work, using every instrument that we have and using it up to the hilt as soon as it's available, to give us the kind of understanding of human beings that will make it possible for us to intervene constructively, not to make the kind of mistakes that we've always made in the past, where we've intervened in patchwork and fixed one thing and not another, and very often our good intentions have had worse results than our bad intentions because we were too ignorant.
Margaret Mead spends much of her energy passing on her ideas. Some of her colleagues think she's overstepping the academic role, but she scorns the ivory tower mentality. She considers it her duty to communicate knowledge wherever it's needed, and if possible, wherever it will have the best effect. Today, a member of over 70 committees, her voice is often heard where influential people meet. As well as talking, she continues to listen as Boas taught her to do. Perched on a corner of the museum, her office is the nerve center for the exchange of ideas from scientists in different disciplines throughout the world. Yet in spite of the turmoil of work, typically she insists on regular meetings to sound out the views of her staff.
So far off, after all, it's just the end of February, is the AAAS presidential address. And what I'm going to do about it, what I'm going to put in it. And it's probably the last social science presidential address for some time.
Is it going to be possible in the future to have somebody like you who straddles the sciences?
Oh, we're always saying it isn't possible. When Boas died, we said it wasn't possible. Then in 1952, we had the Wintergren International Conference on Anthropology and put it all together again. Then you have 10 or 15 years where everybody says it isn't possible, and then you do it again. Unless are able to put the sciences together so they make some kind of comprehensible whole, that are comprehensible to laymen. And remember, everybody, a botanist is a layman to a physicist, and both of them are laymen to analysis of English literature or whatever. Unless the world can become intelligible again to laymen, we don't have very much chance of making a go of it.
The concern that you show, and also perhaps the optimism, suggests a very deep religious feeling. Is religion very important in your life?
Well, I think all of our lives in the end are a matter of faith. As Whitehead pointed out, it's as true of science as it is of religion. That in the end, we live by faith.
But you are a very religious person.
Well, it's very hard for someone to say of themselves that they're very religious. But I find religion meaningful.
What would you like to be remembered for?
Oh, I think that I lived long enough to be of some human use. And I think it's very important at present for people to realize that in this era, at least, that the experience that people of my age has had, if it's used, can be very valuable.
So you want to be remembered more for the impact you've had on the life of your contemporaries rather than as a scientist?
Look, I don't think they're different. You keep trying to put scientists in a box. I am a scientist and I am an anthropologist. And that's my particular area of competence, as the social workers say. And, but I certainly don't want to be remembered because I wrote a good book on a kinship system. I'd like to be remembered for having had some relationship to the growth of the human sciences and the relationship of the human sciences to the contemporary world.
You're working and living at a most furious pace. How many more years do you think you want to keep this up?
I haven't any idea whatsoever. You know, when I was 30, I sat on a mountaintop in New Guinea and decided I had paid back every debt I owed to society for bringing me here and feeding me and educating me and teaching me. And whatever I did from then on was simply gratuitous. So now I've had 45 gratuitous years.